Thank you all for being here today. This is a free book talk event with Dr. Lane Demas, and I will introduce him in just a moment. But my name is Kelly Lawler, and I am a co-chair of Rediscover Mapledale. I also co-chair with Stacey Goldman, who just couldn't be here today. But we are both residents of Stowe, and we are delighted to share this history with you. It is with great excitement that we are able to stand before you and share the long-lasting vision of Rediscover Mapledale. This initiative is dedicated to commemorating Black history in Stowe, Massachusetts, educating our community about this rich history, and celebrating the centennial anniversary of the Mapledale Country Club in 2026. Like I said, am a resident of Stowe, and when I found out about this history that was in our very own backyard, I was just very excited. I asked people if they knew about this history of Black golf, Robert H. Hawkins, and the Mapledale Country Club, and I was met with many faces of people who weren't aware of the history, and so that's why we're here today. We were lucky enough to walk into this project at a time when this historic site had already been placed under a conservation restriction through the town of Stowe in order to protect the land from future development, thus guaranteeing ongoing conservation, ecological restoration, and the historic preservation of the site. How we got started at Rediscover Mapledale was with a community meeting. We reached out to the community and we invited everyone to our town library to talk about Mapledale. And what we decided is that we should really create 3 phases for our project. So we got started in the fall or winter of 2022. And we started with our first phase to create a website and to connect with historical consultants. So we worked with Interpreting Sports, and they are also going to help us in phase 2 of our project this year, where we are installing wayfinding stations at Stowe Acres Country Club. All right, so if you need to know a little bit more about Mapledale Country Club, you can always check out our website, and we hope to continue to provide free events like this for you. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lane Demas. Thank you so much for coming. He is on vacation, and so he's making special time for us. But here's just a little bit about his background. So he is a professor at Central Michigan University. He specializes in the history of race and popular culture in America, specifically sport and African American history. He is the author of 2 books, Game of Privilege and African American History of Golf, which we'll be focusing on today, and Integrating the Gridiron, Black Civil Rights and American College Football. His media appearances include interviews in major print outlets like the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, and the Boston Globe. He's also been on radio and television like ESPN. Professor Demas has earned awards through the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Fulbright Program, and the United States Golf Association. He has a BA from Northwestern, an MA from the University of California, and a PhD also from the University of California, Irvine. So this is all Game of Privilege, Black Golf, and Mapledale. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate you inviting me. Happy to take time off from a wild vacation with the family to talk a little bit about Mapledale. And I'll just speak a little bit to what I know about Mapledale, which may not be as much as what you folks know here at the local level, and also try to contextualize, I think, the importance of the site and of the story at the national level. So, 1926, Mapledale Country Club, what's today Stowe Acres Country Club, became one of the first 10 or so golf courses owned and operated by African Americans in United States history. And the lists vary, but if you take a look at a list of significant African American owned and operated courses in American history that we know of, you can see, again, Stowe sort of in the top 10 on this list in terms of the earliest courses. For example, the same date, 1926, you can see Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, the historically HBCU in Alabama opened a small 9-hole course as well that same year. But this was rare. So, 1926. An early date, by the way, in the history of modern golf. Folks tend to think, and what the news and sports channels try to imply, is this significant, long history, ancient history of golf with cameras flying over trophies and things on CBS and whatnot. Golf has a long history, true, but mostly in Europe, actually. On the American side, modern golf was quite recent to, say, a date like 1926. We have references to golf in early colonial America, as some English, some Scottish immigrants perhaps bringing some clubs over just to hit some balls around in green spaces. But it goes away then. And really, the modern game only emerges in the United States in the late 19th century. So our traditional first American golf course, for example, Oakhurst in West Virginia, dates to 1884. You might be more familiar with Shinnecock Hills, for example, on Long Island, the oldest golf country club in U.S. history, established in 1891. Here in Boston, Brookline built its golf course in 1893. So only about 35 years old, Shinnecock, Brookline, when Mapledale opened in 1926. So American golf was only really kind of in its second generation when a wealthy merchant named Charles Cox began encouraging African Americans to visit Stowe. Cox hired a black man, Robert Hawkins, to operate his 196-acre Randall Estate, which eventually featured a large mansion, tennis equestrian facilities, and the 9-hole golf course opening in 1926. And we have some images of Hawkins as well. This is from 1937, so in a UGA program. And the picture itself may actually date to the 20s. So this may be an image of Hawkins, basically contemporary with Mapledale's opening. Who was Hawkins? He was a golf man through and through. He had considerable experience in golf management. He had risen up the caddy ranks at courses in Vermont and Massachusetts. Caddying was the key way in which young men tended to enter the industry of golf, especially black men, throughout the country, not just the South. He had served as a general manager of a country club out in Wayland, Massachusetts, likely the first in the state black man to manage a country club in Massachusetts. When Hawkins purchased Mapledale in 1926, it immediately provided a highly visible site for autonomous black golf, really at a national level. So some black-owned, black-operated courses are kind of built from the ground up as black, like, say, for example, Tuskegee's course, Idlewild in Michigan, are the black resort courses. Mapledale, like others, seemed to sort of evolve over time from sympathetic white-owned properties that perhaps welcomed black recreation or even specifically targeted black clients. But 1926, with the golf course open, Hawkins in full control, it was a fully black golf course in every sense of the word. On weekends, white residents noticed caravans of black golfers making their way out from Boston and surrounding areas to play this course. But I will say this also meant that Mapledale likely continued to be open to plenty of white clients, that sort of its white history didn't simply go away, and likely white golfers continued to frequent the course after 1926 as well. So Mapledale wasn't the first black golf course in American history. It may not have been necessarily as exclusively black as some others, but its timing was impeccable, the 1920s. After World War I, the migration of some 1.5 million African Americans from the South helped encourage a flurry of autonomous black national organizations, including in sports. Many of you may be most familiar, for example, with the rise of Negro League Baseball. There had been autonomous black professional and semi-professional baseball leagues going back to the 1800s, but the height of Negro League baseball is the 1920s, right? Rube Foster establishes the Negro National League in 1920, so we're right in the meat of this period in sports and in also political, social organizations of the establishment of truly national black organizations under segregation. The same was happening in golf. Golf had a sort of more complicated structure, say, than even Major League Baseball. There were already, by this point, two organizations that served to sort of set the standard for the rules of golf, management of golf, you name it. The first, the United States Golf Association, or the USGA, which dated 1894, was the oldest. The second, now that had just come along about 10 years before, in 1916, the Professional Golfers Association of America, or the PGA. Both these national organizations, by the way, had flirted with black participation in all kinds of capacities before, especially the USGA, which going back to the 1890s had black players competing in, for example, the first U.S. Opens in the 1890s. But by this point, by Hawkins' day and Mapledale's day, and really by World War I, both these two key national golf entities, the PGA and the USGA, were effectively white only, generally implicitly. Golf will eventually also have this unique dynamic of making that exclusion even more explicit than other sports. So, for example, Major League Baseball will not necessarily have a constitution that includes, only white players can play Major League Baseball. It's more of an implicit color line that holds in segregated baseball. The PGA, infamously, in 1934, will actually add what's called the Caucasian Clause to its constitution, that it is explicitly formalized that you must be Caucasian to be a member of the PGA. So that will come within just a few years of Mapledale. And it'll hold, by the way, till Charlie Sifford in 1961. This is the same period also, by the way, of the opening of Augusta National Golf Course in 1932, the first Masters tournament that many are familiar with, 1934. So we're in this important period in which the color line is hardening in golf, right as golf is sort of becoming increasingly more popular, and the two national organizations are increasingly, and clearly by this point, white only. So, when Hawkins purchased Mapledale in 1926, black golfers around the country weren't just limited to where they could play, which courses may or may not be accommodating, but opportunities that perhaps had been there 30 years before were now closed. Right? Things seem to be moving in the wrong direction. And some, again, were also interested in organizing a national black golfing organization, exclusive tournaments for African Americans, gatherings to forge some sort of ongoing black entity to rival the PGA, to rival the USGA, which clearly had embraced segregation by this point. Great Migration Chicago emerged as sort of the first key location here, with South Side public courses in Chicago now opening to black participants and migrants. Some excellent players winning tournaments against white players. The black press as well was very important in this development. The Chicago Defender in the 1920s, and here's a later cartoon from the Chicago Defender. The best way I know how to stop your husband from playing golf is to play with him, says the woman, right? So again, hardy har har, the same sort of golf jokes. The Chicago Defender was the most important black newspaper in the country. It was a national newspaper distributed nationally in the 1920s. By this point, it has not only golf jokes and like, it has a sort of regular golf column, actually, in which sports writers are addressing golf from the angle of black players, from sort of a black perspective on elite golf. So the black press, the black community in Chicago played a big role in propagating golf and growing interest. Also, not surprisingly, 1922, a group of black golfers hosted kind of a small, what they call National Open tournament at a city course in Chicago. More importantly, 3 years later, 1925, a course called Shady Rest Country Club, which was a new black-owned, just like Mapledale, black-owned course in New Jersey, outside New York City, hosted a larger 2-day tournament that it dubbed the, quote, National Colored Open Golf Championship. And that event drew 35 players from 10 different states, most, again, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago golfers. They included a lot of top players like Pat Ball, who we'll talk about, John Shippen, the man who had played actually in those first U.S. Opens back in the 1890s, is much older by that point. And Shippen actually soon became Shady Rest's club professional. Although very small, that event is also notable because it attracted 2 cameramen from none other than Fox News, actually. We have footage of some of the earliest black golf tournaments, thanks to Fox News. That is William Fox's newsreel that he had silent newsreel that he'd established in 1919. In 1925, William Fox sent 2 cameramen to this black golf course outside New York City. And I have some of that footage. Again, you're welcome to see footage from the 1925 tournament at Shady Rest. Just so we can kind of get a sense of a course like Mapledale, small gallery of onlookers, black participants in a tournament. Probably the first black golf tournament in history to be filmed. Perhaps even the earliest surviving footage of black people playing golf, moving footage that we have of black people playing golf, especially women. There's a lot of women, footage of women playing golf at Shady Rest in 1925. So, Shady Rest was a key black-owned and operated golf club for elite African Americans in New York, New Jersey. Even W.B. Du Bois for a time as a member. But Mapledale, here outside Boston, would compete quickly and at times win out over Shady Rest in terms of sort of being the golf mecca for the black elite. In particular, 2 doctors from Washington, D.C., George Adams and Albert Harris, who really wanted to, like Hawkins, organize black golfers nationally. They traveled often to Mapledale and enjoyed playing there with Hawkins and other African Americans from the Boston region, and seemed perhaps to sort of prize Mapledale over Shady Rest in New Jersey. So the following year, 1926, the 2 doctors, Adam and Harris, along with Robert Hawkins in Stowe, hosted another national tournament at Mapledale. This was larger than the tournament we have footage of from 1925. A larger group of players, 9 we know came from Chicago alone, including Pat Ball, I'll talk about, probably the best black player in the country at the time, Walter Speedy, another leading golfer from Chicago, Horace McDougall as well. More importantly, this time they also successfully used this gathering at Mapledale to launch a true national black golfing organization that would be the black golfing equivalent of Negro League Baseball. At first they called it the United States Colored Golfers Association, with players sort of pledging to send members from their respective black city clubs each year to determine a national champion. By 1929, they had changed the association's name to the United Golfers Association, or the UGA, as it will be known from that point on. And again, my book includes, for example, a listing of every UGA national tournament from that point on in the winter. And you can see, eventually, especially after World War II, some major players in competitive golf that people may be more familiar with, like Ted Rhodes, Charlie Sifford, Lee Elder, the man who integrates the Masters Golf Tournament in 1975. Essentially, before Tiger Woods, every major black golfer at the national level has some connection to UGA tournaments and generally is competing for a time in the UGA by that point. And it all starts right here at Mapledale in 1926. Both Shady Rest in New Jersey and Mapledale here in Massachusetts continued to schedule tournaments, often I found on subsequent weekends. So the same players could sort of travel to compete, say, in New Jersey, then come on down for the UGA tournament the following week at Mapledale. So between Shady Rest and Mapledale, you get the UGA forging the nation's first black golf tour, right? A professional, semi-professional golf tour. And within just 5 years, it's added its name to several more tournaments hosted by black clubs around the country. Fairly quickly, by the way, UGA tournaments will be held out west in California by the 30s, and then even in the South. The UGA will hold tournaments by the 40s and 50s in the South. So Mapledale held the first 3 UGA national tournaments, in fact, 1926, 27, and 28. This, of course, also means that Mapledale hosted the best black golfers that we know of, and probably some we don't know about, before World War II. And I'll just talk briefly to introduce you to some of these individuals. They all have fascinating stories. One of them was a man named Porter Washington. We know that Washington had emerged in Chicago's lively black golf scene, but he had moved to Massachusetts to become a head professional and instructor for Hawkins at Mapledale. And Washington won the 1928 UGA National with what they call a record low round. I don't know the actual scores and these things. He also won that year's Philadelphia UGA tournament at Cobb's Creek Golf Course, which is the key course for black golfers in that city. And Washington would continue playing UGA events into the 1940s. He's also interesting, I think, because eventually we see Washington not just for a time working at Mapledale, earning some money at Mapledale, but he's also, working as a chef in Boston. And this is quite common, and I think speaks to, again, the challenge of making ends meet in the world of golf. By the way, for white golf in this period as well, but especially in the world of black golf, it was difficult to sustain a career in this industry. A few were able to devote themselves full time, from again sort of caddies up to course professionals or instructors, or like Hawkins, owners of courses, but most did not. The 1940 UGA national champion Hugh Smith worked at an industrial plant in Georgia. John Brooks Dindy, who won 3 of these national championships in the 1930s, some would argue the best black golfer of the 1930s, was so financially strapped that he goes back to the same white country club in North Carolina where he grew up caddying and took up the game, and he's working as a locker room attendant for the same white country club where he had grown up, right? And you're talking about a man who wins 3 UGA Nationals. Is probably the best black golfer of the 1930s. So, I'm also fascinated by the sort of socioeconomic and social dynamics of a place like Mapledale. White clubs like Shinnecock or Brookline were built by and featured elite members, socioeconomically, politically, you name it. A black club like Mapledale, however, tended to be a lot more diverse. Members, golfers, continuing to work more blue-collar jobs. At the same time, however, they also are, yes, the domain of a kind of black elite. So you see a lot of black doctors and black lawyers, black dentists, right, at these courses like Shady Rest or Mapledale, NAACP leaders, black clergy, which is very interesting to me, right, because the church is so critical in African American history. Especially here in New England, the church has an uncomfortable relationship with the history of golf, right? It's a place where, golf is banned on Sunday and all that stuff, right? So for pastors to play, but in the world of African American history, right, ministers, it's a key sort of middle class black elite job, and you see a lot of black ministers gravitate to golf. So it likely the black clientele, the folks playing at Mapledale, would have been a kind of interesting, diverse group of black people. And yes, plenty were elite. For instance, Horace McDougall, another early UGA standout, which I'll mention, McDougal was, again, from Chicago, played in the Mapledale tournaments. And 3 years earlier, in fact, in 1923, he had joined Northwestern University's golf team in Evanston, Illinois. We have an image of from the yearbook, the 1923 Northwestern University golf team, and there is Horace McDougal, the first African American to play intercollegiate, predominantly white intercollegiate golf. At a time, again, when 1920, about 2,000 black people are pursuing college degrees. It's very rare. Here at Mapledale, you have the man who's integrated major college golf playing in these tournaments. But the best player to appear at the Mapledale tournaments was perhaps, again, the best black golfer in the country in the 1920s, and his name was Robert Ball. He went by Pat Ball. And I have an image of Pat and his wife Cleo, by the way, later in 1941. Cleo, in her own right, was a crackerjack player, and in fact, the husband and wife team both won the UGA National. Cleo, his wife, won the women's division in 1941. Pat won the men's division. But when Hawkins opened Mapledale in 1926, Pat Ball was in his prime and probably the best black player in the country. Ball was born in Atlanta. He had caddied for the famed white amateur champion Bobby Jones before coming up to Chicago. Chicago city courses were opening up slowly but surely for black players, but there were barriers. As early as 1918, for example, Pat Ball met the qualifications to compete for the Chicago City Championship at Jackson Park, but was left out of the finals. He was not allowed to play for mysterious reasons in the sort of 60 players in the finals of the Chicago City Championship. So a UGA tournament, the organization, and these gatherings at a place like Mapledale helped sustain Pat Ball's golfing prowess, further press for opportunities against white players. Ball he'll win many of UGA tournaments, including the National 4 times. He won the 1927 tournament at Mapledale, 1929 up at Shady Rest, win again 1934, and again back here in Boston at Ponkapoag? How you pronounce it? Ponkapoag Golf Course in Boston. We know the celebration in Chicago was quite pronounced at this early gathering in 1927 at Mapledale. When he returned to Chicago, Pat Ball, after he won at Mapledale, he was celebrated by the Chicago Defender and the city's black golfers. They threw a huge banquet in his honor. They crowned him the Golf King, in the press. Chicago was very in tune with this tournament here in Boston, in Stowe. 2 years later, he set, again, what they called the course record at Shady Rest as he won the 1929 UGA National. So with his success, support from the UGA and clubs like Mapledale, Pat Ball continued to challenge discrimination at white tournaments more than any other black golfer in the 1920s and 1930s. He eventually was regularly winning local tournaments against white players back in Chicago, including, for example, the Cook County Open in 1927, which can give us a sense of kind of the quality of golf at Mapledale. The same year he won this tournament at Mapledale, he returned and won the Cook County Open against white players in Chicago. He won the Cook County Open again in 29 and 1934. And even in 1928, he and Porter Washington, that man Hawkins hired to be a head pro at Mapledale, staged an exhibition match against 2 white PGA pros up at Shady Rest. And in fact, the most significant, what I think, pre-war challenge at a national tournament took place in 1928 when Pat Ball and another black golfer named Elmer Stout qualified for the USGA's Public Links National Championship. USGA had established this in 1922. It was supposed to be the everyman golf tournament, the Public Links National Championship, right? You didn't have to be a member of an elite club or anything. You were supposed to be for public golfers. So there was a USGA national tournament that seemingly was open to the prospect of black players. This was it. Ball and Stout qualified for it. It was a course familiar to Ball. It was played at Cobb's Creek in Philadelphia, where he had won the UGA tournament there the previous year. Both men participated in the opening rounds. By the way, Ball was tied for sixth after the first round. Both men qualified for the tournament's final. Some white participants had grumbled or objected, but everything appeared fine on the surface until abruptly USGA officials confronted both men, told them they were disqualified from the finals for a scoring error. Pat Ball Stout immediately went to a Philadelphia court. They sought an injunction to halt the event to allow them to continue playing. What followed in an literally as the tournament is winding down still on the golf course, an emergency 4-hour meeting in court in Philadelphia in which the players squared off against lawyers representing the USGA, in particular Ganson Depew, who was head of the USGA's Public Links Division. He was the nephew of the former New York Senator Chauncey Depew, to give you a sense of the elites running the USGA in this period. The hearing revealed details that were embarrassing to the USGA and Depew. It turned out all along a number of players had been disgruntled and wanted to get these two black guys out of the Public Links National Championship. USGA officials had discussed before the tournament all kinds of ways of how to get rid of these guys. And worse, although the players were responsible, which is common in golf at that point, for policing the rules themselves, Ball and Stout had been followed by men posing as reporters who were charged with looking for golf infractions as an excuse to disqualify them from the tournament. At the end of this court hearing, the judge was shocked, ruled in favor of Pat Ball and Elmer Stout, and told the USGA that the tournament must include them. The USGA said the tournament is almost already over. The tournament would have to be canceled. The judge said, well, how about take the white winner of the tournament, and then the white winner has to play these two black guys, and then that's the true winner of the Public Links National Championship. And the USGA says, well, we can't do that either. And the judge says, essentially, you have to figure something out, or this entire national championship is canceled. So the elites from the USGA go out to the hallway outside the courtroom and have no idea what to do. And at that moment, vindicated from the charges of cheating, Pat Ball and Stout then approached the USGA representatives with a significant gesture. They said in order to save the tournament, they would voluntarily withdraw from it. They said for the good of the game, as the press said, which is a later tagline for the USGA, for the good of the game. The judge announced it was an example of exceptionally good sportsmanship. The USGA that day applauded the men, offered to pay their traveling expenses. Reaction in the black community was more mixed, as you would imagine. Ball and Stout were cheered for sort of exposing racism in the rarefied world of the USGA at a national golf tournament. Other black observers, sports writers, were upset. Why did you give in, right? You should have cratered the whole tournament. One black sports writer echoed that criticism. Quote, it's okay to show high-class sportsmanship, providing that you're dealing with high-class sportsmen, he wrote. We've got to fight fire with fire and quit compromising, unquote, right? So the black sports writers were split over this gesture from Pat Ball. But regardless, sites like Mapledale, being a UGA champion, had clearly emboldened someone like Pat Ball and other black golfers in just 2 or 3 years to have more personal confidence, professional chops, and even legal footing to take on racial segregation in the PGA and the USGA. Unfortunately, by the way, that sportsmanship did not last. When he attempted just 5 years later to reintegrate the U.S. Open in 1933 in Chicago, Pat Ball received a letter from the competition committee of the USGA that said he was banned from all future USGA national tournaments because of his conduct in Philadelphia 5 years before, right? That letter, by the way, is signed by Prescott Bush, who later became head of the USGA in 1935. You may know him as the father of future President George H.W. Bush, grandfather of future President George W. Bush. So again, by the time you get to 1935 and Prescott Bush, the USGA is again basically demonizing Pat Ball, even though Ball had been vindicated in a Philadelphia courtroom. Ball and Stout, other UGA players, including many who played at Mapledale, would make numerous other attempts like that to reintegrate USGA national tournaments. So for these players, Porter Washington, Pat Ball, Horace McDougall, many others, Mapledale, these handful of early black country clubs were critical lifelines for them in the 1920s and the 1930s. And within a few years, eventually corporate sponsorship, the attendance of prominent individuals would help expand these tournaments into larger multi-day events, just as any other sort of white PGA tournament tended to do, by including a full social program, as they called it, for participants, for fans, banquets, dances, musicians, speeches. Chicago, by the 1930s, is hosting UGA tournaments that, again, set a precedent for future gatherings to combine the golf tournament with other events for the black community. The UGA never recorded attendance. It's clear that more fans showed up after 1926 as the tour grew. As early as 1936, about 8 years after Mapledale hosted its last tournament, the UGA National in Philadelphia drew so many observers that the city's mounted police were called in to sort of hold the gallery back. The 1951 championship drew 400 golfers and an estimated 5,000 fans to Cleveland for the UGA National. Earlier that year in Atlanta, the UGA Southern Open had been held on the same weekend as the NAACP's National Convention. So they were busing NAACP delegates back and forth to Atlanta's Black Golf Club, Lincoln Country Club, to meet and shake hands with heavyweight boxer Joe Louis, who was very popular, of course. And they watched Charlie Sifford, by the way, win his first national tournament as a professional golfer. UGA events also quickly will attract some white players and fans to the links, especially after celebrities like Joe Louis begin to compete. An estimated 1/4 of the gallery in Boston in 1941 at the UGA National was white. After Lewis had pressed the governor of Massachusetts, Leverett Saltonstall, to let the event take place at the exclusively white club, the Ponkapoag Golf Course. And one thing to think about here in Stowe is that 1941 controversy is so soon after Mapledale that you have Joe Louis, the most recognizable athlete, arguably in the world at that point, publicly bartering with the governor of Massachusetts over hosting a UGA event. Does the governor know that Massachusetts birthed the UGA that Mapledale had hosted back in the 1920s? I don't know. Or was it all forgotten by that point? Of course, most golfers at Mapledale and most black golfers, period, weren't particularly serious or exceptional players. Still, for more typical black players, locations like Mapledale embodied northern opportunity, a higher standard of living, the optimism of the Great Migration, along with the slowly increased access to municipal city-owned courses in northern cities. African American women in particular, frequenting public courses, were particularly powerful images of opportunity, both for black southern migrants, northern white observers, you name it. Countless advertisements in the 1920s presented golf as the ideal leisure activity for the new woman, right? This is the period, the flapper, you name it, the new woman after World War I. The modern woman of means. And golf was a central sort of component of selling that new woman ideal in the white press. Here, Mapledale and the UGA again developed a notable feature that distinguished them from other black sporting sites and organizations: a full women's division very quickly. By 1930, the UGA has a full women's division. You don't see that in Negro League Baseball, which very rarely kind of like a league of their own, that kind of flirts with female baseball. But in this world of golf, right? So I'm not sure of the gender breakdown of everyday players at Mapledale, but if it's like Shady Rest, if it's like the Chicago Defender, then there's likely a surprising number and ratio of black women who play out at this course in the late 1920s. And in many ways, black women taking up the game at that time was even more sort of symbolic than black men doing so. So on the one hand, Mapledale and the UGA exemplified the kind of stereotypical hype of the Great Migration, an escape from worsening, stifling Jim Crow in the South to a land of opportunity, where a black middle class, if not elite lifestyle, was possible with less racial discrimination, even the wives enjoying golf, country club life. But on the other hand, while a black club like Mapledale exemplified the opportunity for social and economic advancement in the North, we also have to contend with the fact that some of the earliest black-owned clubs appeared in the South, right? Black businessmen in Richmond, Virginia built the Acorn Country Club in 1924, which predates Mapledale. The two most important black-owned courses in the South, Atlanta, Georgia, I already mentioned, Jacksonville, Florida, both those courses were called the Lincoln Country Club, also established at the same time as Mapledale in the 1920s. So not only were there some clubs like Mapledale in the South already, but pretty quickly it became apparent that perhaps the best black golfers resided in the South, not Boston, not Chicago. Initially, the gatherings at Mapledale and elsewhere, these UGA tournaments, drew mostly golfers from the Northeast, Midwest. But by 1930, players from the South, and even the far West, regularly participated, and all of a sudden black Southerners began showing up to these UGA tournaments in the North at places like Mapledale and cleaning house. No one should have been surprised at this sort of ascendance of Southern players. The UGA was established in these sort of golfing communities of the Northeast and the Midwest. Most of its tournaments took place there. Black people had fought successfully for access to municipal courses in some cases, or established their own courses like Mapledale. But golf thrived in the heart of the segregated South still, black golf. There, far more African Americans encountered the game as caddies, as groundskeepers, found opportunities and space to establish their own segregated world of golf in the Deep South. So black sports writers and many black Northerners were shocked and didn't know what to do with the fact that all of a sudden Southerners were coming up and outperforming Pat Ball, outperforming these Northern black players. Sports writers scrambled to explain a game like golf. How could the best black golfers come out of the segregated South and not here in the northern land of opportunity? So that surprise, again, indicated how the reality of race and golf differed from the public perception. Southerners dominating the UGA seemed to sort of belie these notions of northern opportunity and refinement symbolizes by places like Mapledale northern courses. That active golf scene in the South didn't kind of fit the popular narrative of the Great Migration itself. Moreover, of course, sometimes the most obscene barriers to black golf came from elsewhere, not the Deep South, like that 1928 Public Links National Championship, which is a story of a Philadelphia courtroom, not the Deep South. White criticism of black-owned courses like Mapledale was common everywhere, including in the South, and I suspect there was some of that in Stowe as well. But in fact, the most dramatic example I found of large-scale white resistance to a place like Mapledale is not New England or the Deep South, but California. And I have an image of the Park Ridge Country Club in Southern California, Corona, California, outside Los Angeles. One of the country's best resorts, Park Ridge, had opened just 1 year before Hawkins opened Mapledale, 1925. An exclusively white membership is perched on a hill spectacular views if you look at the image of the clubhouse there. Park Ridge had a large hotel even, indoor spa, a shooting range, a private airstrip. Its first member was the silent film star Clara Bow. A very young Henry Fonda, even younger Burt Lancaster visited Park Ridge in the 1920s. This golf course was among the best in Southern California. But within 2 years it struggled financially, and in 1927 it went up for sale. And 3 black businessmen in Southern California purchased the resort. So far, a story a lot like Mapledale, the exact same timeline as Mapledale. But there the story diverged. In Southern California, news of the purchase of an elite golf course from 3 black men came right as the Ku Klux Klan experienced the height of its popularity in Southern California and nationwide. By the way, historians estimate 4 to 5 million members of the Klan in 1925. 3 years earlier, the Klan had won control of the city council of a city, Anaheim, California, which then was a sleepy farm community in 1925. The local Klan organized an immediate vitriolic response to 3 black men purchasing a golf country club. Park Ridge's white members also sued the white owner to try to stop this sale, attempting to prevent the club from falling into the hands of Negroes, they said, leaving, quote, a black spot on Corona's forward progress, unquote. And their campaign of hate worked. A dramatic incident of racism directed at the prospect of black golfers in California, including, by the way, a burning cross on the club's front lawn. The Klan burned a cross at Park Ridge and threatened a race war. By 1929, the black buyers were forced to withdraw their bid, and the club, rather than becoming a black country club like Mapledale, instead was turned into a medical sanitarium eventually by 1930. It left golf completely. So, an indication of the challenge and the remarkable sight of a place like Mapledale, looking at, say, the story of Park Ridge in California. Closer here in the Northeast, other examples of discrimination, again, helped contextualize how important and unique Mapledale was. If you look at the list of major sort of lawsuits, desegregation lawsuits in the world of golf, you see a series of lawsuits, eventually, of course, after World War II, chipping away at segregated golf in the South. But up until the war, clear, important lawsuits came from this region of the country. New York, for instance, had a series of important lawsuits surrounding the segregation and integration of golf well after 1926. Courses that openly advertised to the public increasingly asserted they were actually private clubs, therefore exempt from state anti-discrimination bills. New York had the first and most robust sort of state anti-discrimination bill, but it didn't matter in that period. Roy Wilkins, a future head of the NAACP, sued a public golf course early in his career, not in the South, right outside New York City in 1940, sued them because they excluded him and his elite associates. And they lost the case against the tiny Central Valley golf course, which successfully went to court and said it was not a place of public accommodation. And Roy Wilkins' lawyers said, here's a sign we took from the side of the road that says open to the public, come stop at this golf course. And it was not enough to convince a New York judge in 1940. They lost the case. 1947, a full 20 years after Mapledale, another group of black golfers sued Westchester Hills outside New York City. It was a even ritzier course, but it was a public golf course. And again, its lawyers successfully argued that it was private, even though it had a hotel, even though it advertised as a public golf course. There were golf courses everywhere, including in the Northeast, who tried to skirt anti-discrimination laws well after World War II and definitely well after 1926. Closer here to Boston, in 1947, again after the war, Theodore Jones was a black accountant from Chicago, vacationing on Martha's Vineyard. And he was turned away from playing golf at Martha's Vineyard Country Club. Jones sued, but yet again, as late as 1947, his attorney failed to convince the court that the golf course was a public amusement, despite, again, numerous advertisements they put before the judge that said this golf course offers a cordial welcome to all Martha's Vineyard visitors, right? So plenty of cases well into the 1940s of northern courses all the time continuing to manipulate distinctions between public, private, semi-private, whatever that means, right? Long before southern leaders responded to the prospect of, say, Brown versus Board of Education or other anti-segregation rulings by privatizing public golf courses. That starts here, New England. Before 1950, there were numerous instances of deceptive privatization on northern courses, as well as city municipal courses leased to private entities to avoid integration in Massachusetts, in New York, in New Jersey. So while African Americans were successfully beginning to access city-owned municipal courses slowly, like in Chicago, Philadelphia, even Boston, Franklin Park, of course, in between the world wars, a course like Mapledale, right there in the late 20s, not just allowing black players, but particularly reaching out to African American clients, owned and operated by African Americans, and forging, again, a national golf organization, the UGA, makes it, I think, a very exceptional and particularly important site in African American history, and definitely in the history of golf in particular. So I'll stop there, but happy to take any questions. Thank you so much again for inviting me.
That was amazing. If anyone has any questions, do you mind just holding up that picture of Robert H. Hawkins? I don't think I've ever seen that before.
And I luckily just came across this. It's not in the book, but when you invited me out here, I looked through the USGA archives that I had downloaded and found that in the USGA. So I can send you that too.
Yes.
And the listing, the USGA library listing.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Wow.
But the listing says again that it's taken from a 1937 UGA program for the national tournament, and I suspect it's probably an older picture. So it's probably what he looked like in the late 20s. Yeah.
So in your research, did you find any, I don't know, as far as today, any monuments or dedications or tributes to the racial history of these golf courses?
It's an excellent question, and it's rare. You do find some. Probably the one most maybe familiar with, Langston Golf Course. Washington, D.C. has a really truly historically black golf course that the clubhouse, I believe, is on the National Registry of Historic Places at Langston. When I visited Langston and played many years ago, and who was in front of me? It was his name Bernard Shaw, CNN anchor. The black anchor at CNN. It's just, Langston had long, to this day, sort of represents sort of the black elite in D.C. in terms of a public golf course. Just very historic and very branded as such for its history. Lee Elder, remember I mentioned you, the first black player to integrate the Masters tournament in Georgia, was integrally involved and even worked for a time as sort of the head pro at Langston in Washington, D.C. And I think it dates to 39 or something. It opened, again, as sort of a segregated golf course for the black community in D.C. So a lot of courses built under segregation by cities don't survive. But some that do, kind of have that recognition. Cedar Crest in Dallas, Texas. But again, it's rare. And especially for a place like Mapledale, private, club, black country club, it's even more rare to see something survive. And I think of a place like where I'm from, Idlewild in Michigan. There's been several books written about Idlewild, a kind of up north resort community. So summer housing, golf course, all that built generally for black elite, Chicago, Cleveland, these places. And so there is sort of some historical markers there and everything, but essentially a ghost, sort of little ghost town in the middle of the woods now. So it's rare to see preservation, to see recognition. It is rare.
You mentioned earlier about Charles Cox and the Randall Estate and his interest to bring black golfers to the club.
Yeah.
And then Hawkins purchases the club from him, and he's interested in having white, players come.
Yeah.
Any sense of why Cox was interested in that? Like anything about what might have led Cox to?
It's. I think it's sort of the $1 million question for you guys, because I'm not sure. You do see in this period, like in Park Ridge and California, you do see, because remember, there's an economic bubble that is in the 1920s, and it bursts, right? And so you do see a lot, and people think about the stock market crashing and all that, but right, I mean, things are starting to contract, especially when you look at the economics of elite private golf and these country clubs. You already see them contracting in the late 20s. So I think a lot out of financial necessity, reaching out to maybe black clientele, clearly being, like in California, being open to a black buyer. A lot of that, I think, is, on the one hand, obviously the moral, or legal sentiment of an area of the country, but it's also the economics of, the clubs need this. I'd also say it's very interesting in the world of black golf, because white golf is sort of, you can argue, starting to decline in popularity. Many people in the late 20s, and especially into the Depression, think that basically golf has sort of peaked in popularity, and you can even argue that it's sort of maybe losing popularity by this period. And in the black community, it's just continuing to go up, I think. So you have this kind of unique kind of 10-year period where, there's still kind of surging interest in the black community to get into this meaningful game, whereas a lot of the sort of national press and the USGA is sort of fearful that the game's contracting. So I think there's a lot of those dynamics at play here. On the flip side, there's a lot more conversation in literature that the UGA and its advocates, its founders, want to brand themselves more as race blind than, say, Negro League Baseball, right? So like I said, they changed the name from U.S. Colored Golfers Association to United Golfers. They deliberately, at a time when that is very rare, they deliberately remove the reference to race from their name, and from the very early point say, sure, if a white golfer wants to join our event, if they want to play, all that. And that, again, is quite unique. I mean, that's not the story of Rube Foster and the Negro League in baseball. So you definitely have a unique dynamic there. I just don't know what that family, right? Because this is, my gathering is that this is a substantial sort of family in Stowe's history, right? And I don't know the dynamics of that family or their politics, racial or otherwise. I don't know. Yeah.
So, how did you get involved with this book, or how did you get to the idea?
So, I was writing a book about college football, as you mentioned, and I was just trying to find some stories that needed more attention. Like Lou Montgomery, by the way, is an important story from Boston College here in the 1941, I think it is. But I can remember, as I was sick of football and thought, what have I gotten myself into? One night, I typed in golf search terms into a major database of African American historical newspapers, and I can remember that night, and like 15,000 hits popped out. And I thought, that the database is broken and all this stuff. And I started clicking on each of those hits, and every one of them was a legitimate hit. That's so that night I realized the Chicago Defender had a regular golf column in the 1920s. It wasn't just rerunning white golf columns, or it wasn't just a black sports writer talking about PGA tournaments. It was like a black golf column for black people, and I was blown away. That night I said, I think I got to...
Are you sick of golf now?
Probably. The irony is I've hardly played. I used to play some, but writing this book, it's been 9 years since I wrote it. Working on this book, we had kids and all these things. So the irony is, once I started writing about golf, I hardly played at all. I used to play some, but everybody asks me at these events, "Do you like golf? Do you play golf?" Not much since I wrote this. But that's just personal. But yeah, I had an interest in golf. I had an interest in more sort of this idea of kind of elite activities, recreation. I was looking up articles on chess, race and chess, and all these parlor games, billiards and stuff. So I was kind of gravitating towards an angle of sport and race that I felt had drawn much less attention than, say, football, and baseball is a big one. Historians love writing about baseball and all that. So I was looking for an angle. But yeah, when I saw the material that was out there, I was blown away. And then as I wrote, like in the sort of the prologue, when I started mentioning to fellow history professors, they said, "Is that a book about Tiger Woods or something?" I said, "Oh, I really know I'm onto something now, because, yeah, there'll be a chapter on Tiger Woods, but boy, there's so much here, people. Just a lot of stories. So I got lucky, and then there was some good foundation already there, right? There's black sports writers that have covered the topic for many years. There's Adair, and he recently passed away, but the USG had relied on a black man's book for many years for sort of its own convoluted understanding of its history. And I must say the USGA has done a lot in like just the last 20 years to really come around to it. It's a difficult story, especially for the USGA, and they've really embraced it. So I've been impressed with them as well. Yeah.
Thank you. This was fascinating, and I'm so glad that we had Stowe TV to record this. So I just wanted to thank a lot of partners that we have. First of all, thank you, Dr. Demas, for coming. I also want to thank Interpreting Sports. I want to thank the town of Stowe, the Conservation Commission, the director, our town manager. Our Historical Society, who is our fiscal sponsor. We also have to thank Freedom's Way for giving us a very generous grant to support this work, to have free events, and to put signage. We are putting in markers at Stowe Acres so that people who visit there are still thousands of people who visit there every year to play golf, know about Mapledale. So on August 26th, it is a Monday, we have a charity golf tournament. It's going to be in the honor of Robert H. Hawkins. It's the first one that we hope to do each year annually. So we need more golfers. And we also want to thank the Mass Cultural Council. We reached out and received grants this year from the Stowe Cultural Council, Lancaster, and Bolton Cultural Councils. So thank you everyone for coming and for this awesome talk.
Thank you. I appreciate